Hi everyone, welcome to Brothers Sisters Estrangement video podcast. I'm Ali John Chaudhry, psychotherapist, and today we have a very interesting conversation that we're going to be having with Fern, of course. This one is on gender differences with regards to sibling estrangement. We're going to try to answer that question because it's a question that comes up often, and I think this is an important topic, and we've got a lot to say on this, so I'll keep it very short for starters today.
I'm Fern Schumer Chapman. I am the author of the upcoming book, Brothers, Sisters, Strangers. It will be available for National Siblings Day 2021, which is April 10th. Anyway, it's always wonderful to be with you, Ali John.
Same here, Fern. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for coming. You've got a lot of material to cover today, so let's get into it right away. I think this is a great topic, and I think that our viewers will certainly identify with a lot of this. So, is there a gender difference with regards to sibling estrangement? Short answer, I would say, is no. There's no difference between males and females when it comes to the type of pain and torment they can experience with ambiguous loss. I think it hurts for both people. But I think that we should answer this question in a different way. Let's try answering it by asking ourselves if men and women process emotions differently. Because the answer to that is yes. And according to science, females are more aware when they get angry as opposed to males. So guys can maybe go from 0 to 100 and not even realize it, whereas women will be very conscientious of that when that occurs. And a meta-analysis I read also suggested that women tend to ruminate more than men. And on a smaller scale, they tend to brood and reflect more than men. So that would explain, I think, a lot of things, namely the fact that we have a lot of female members in estrangement groups. I think that overwhelmingly the gender represented is women. And of course, I think that there's expected societal interactions within families or with siblings that can be more upsetting, I think, with women than for men in general. And I want to kind of explain why that is. I'm not going to minimize that because, of course, I'm a man and I experienced my fair share of estrangement with my sister too. But I think it's important we talk about fight or flight. And something that's very important is, according to a recent study they did with university students, it would seem that there are gender differences when it comes to how males and females process conflict. Now, men will tend to be more in terms of the fight or flight narrative. And what this does is this brings them more to withdraw. And that's the flight response that guys can have when it comes to that. They will either withdraw or either fight. And the fight response can usually be just to say things, nasty things and such, but afterwards they would tend to withdraw. And because lines of communication remain closed with men, we could say that estrangement can be more long-lasting and persistent because of that. Now, in terms of women tend to experience things differently when it comes to conflict, and you can weigh in on this too, Fern, of course. I think that women tend to go often with the tend and befriend approach, according to the research I read. And what that means basically is that stress can be experienced and dealt with by looking to establish closeness with other people. And they may tend to make amends or reestablish contact with an estranged relationship. So that's the tend and befriend approach that women will tend to have. And that might largely explain why there's ruminations.
Which also explains why we have so many members of these chat rooms who are female. They are looking for comfort and reassurance that they're okay. And this is a unique experience, but others are also having it as well. So I think you raise a really interesting point about the way in which men respond, which is to often shut down. And women, on the other hand, brood and personalize. So there can be an estrangement, and men make the choice to deny their own feelings and not to address what's going on within themselves, whereas women take that estrangement and they feel, oh, it must be my fault.
Mhm. Now, I want to be careful, of course, to say that there's not men that aren't experiencing rumination and such. I think that that does happen with some men. You know, we're going with generalities in terms of general tendencies here, because I'm very aware of my own estrangement experience too, and I do tend to, of course, sometimes think about it. But yes, I agree. I think that in general, women do tend to somehow bear the societal expectation that there shouldn't be any conflict. And I think that society in general also seems to reward women for being happy. And that's the societal expectation, whereas men are rewarded oftentimes for being angry. And we just need to look at our politicians just to see why that is and how that manifests, you know, without naming anybody. But but I do think that that's important to kind of bring up too.
Yeah, and I think that brings me to my point about the patriarchy, which is the male dominations within the family. And this goes back to the ancients and to the Bible, where boy children were favored over the firstborns over other children or over female offspring. We are raised, and again, we're talking in generalities, but we are often raised in families where boy children are favored or they're treated differently. And I saw this in my survey. A lot of women talked about how they were minimized and expected to serve within the family. They also carry the family forward. So it is the female responsibility to mediate problems and to nurture relationships and organize holidays. And men have a much more minimal role, typically, in all of that. And the problem is that if men don't take responsibility for their feelings and they don't take responsibility for their role in the family, you can end up with this huge gap between what's expected of men and women. And that, again, I think is rooted in the patriarchy.
I agree, and I think that that's really important what you're saying there, because it's the expectations that somehow weigh down on us and how things should be. And I hear this often in some of the forums that we partake in, where people will say, "Well, it's not supposed to be like this," and how there's a concurring pressure, if you will, coming from the outside, might be societal or the patriarchy, as you say, that says, "Well, roles should be established like this, and this is how it should be." And when we're experiencing the type of ambiguous loss with estrangement, particularly sibling estrangement, we tend to weigh down on ourselves sometimes, and that's the pain that and torment that comes with that, is how it's supposed to be, and yet what our reality is.
And this can have terrible consequences, because what happens in these dysfunctional families spills out into the community. And so you can have men who abuse women because they had certain expectations in the original family, and that they were inundated and inculcated with this idea that the women are to serve them, or the women are to meet their needs. And it's a really dangerous path, I would say, for not just women, but for men too, because that puts a lot of pressure on men as well.
I agree. I think that that's the issue, I think, oftentimes that occurs. And I'm just thinking here of a particular example of somebody that came to me once and was telling me how he was born within a blue collar family, and he was more of an intellectual, and he would often be disparaged, or he would often be belittled or demeaned, and somehow he thought something was wrong with him because he had this whole patriarchy that was basically denouncing him and denouncing his behaviors as somehow not fitting in because of his persuasion in being more of an intellectual. And luckily for him, he rose up and he was able to experience the value and in who he was. So that his initially thwarted self-esteem was able to transform itself in that he saw his strength in who he was, because somebody did believe in him and in his environment, and that made the difference for him.
Well, when I say too that this particularly hurts men, when men form their own families and have a spouse of their own, this can really affect the dynamics of the entire extended family relationships. So one of the things that many of the survey respondents commented on is that brothers often married, or sometimes married, women who made it their mission to extract the husband from his family. And this is a devastating pattern. And there were a lot of respondents that blamed this pattern on the sibling estrangement that resulted. So they would say, well, we had a wonderful relationship until he got married. And once he got married, he did what his wife told him to do. And he took no responsibility for his role in the family. And this is what I'm talking about as far as male patriarchy and how devastating it can be and hurt men as well as women. Ultimately, some of these men finally, after decades, come around and say, oh my gosh, look what I've done. I have no support system because I didn't cultivate those relationships when they mattered.
And I agree. I think that there's something to that too. I think that I heard sometime before that when people get divorced, the woman is the one that runs away with the black book of all the contacts, and oftentimes the male is left with very little. But it's because he didn't cultivate those relationships. He put, of course, the onus on the female in that way. So I think that, again, you're very right about bringing this up, because this is so insidious. It starts very small. It starts very innocently, where men will differ naturally to women when it comes to family matters. And all of a sudden, you know, if you don't start to show up in the relationship or take or start to participate and feed these different areas, then yes, there's going to be something sorely lacking in some of those areas. And of course, this phenomenon you just said, where the spouse basically almost just absorbs the husband with regards to that, and that they disappear altogether from the family. And yes, it's troubling.
It's also classic abuse, and it doesn't just happen to men. There were survey respondents who had sisters. One sister would say the other sister got married, and once she married this man, she was pulled out of the family. So I want to make clear that we are talking in generalities, and we have to be careful with that. But I do think it raises interesting questions, and I know in the future we're going to talk more about birth placement, but I also wonder, and of course there's so little research on all of this, so there probably aren't good answers, but I also wonder if that means that brother-sister sibling estrangement is more common than sister-sister sibling estrangement, because men are less capable of discussing their feelings. And of course, in my book, this question of how one reconciles. Do you have to go ahead and discuss what drove this particular estrangement, or can people actually pick up and move forward? Now, in my case, I did reconcile with my brother. I had to talk to him about it. I needed to know why. What happened? Why did you feel this way? And he did cooperate with me. But there are others who are able to make the reconciliation without even a discussion. Now, I have to say, some of my respondents said, yes, we reconciled, but we never talked about it, and as a result, I can never trust him.
Well, this is a big question, like you say. There's so many things in what you just said there that we could delve deeper into, and I agree. I agree that we need to make room for this, perhaps in the next podcast episode. Definitely, that and birth order, I think, is especially important. But yes, I mean, I think that. You know, I think there may be some differences perhaps with sister-to-sister estrangement versus brother-to-sister estrangement. You know, it could be interesting to see and maybe look into that a little bit further. But it would certainly corroborate a lot of what we've talked about, because I think that sometimes there's male stubbornness involved. Saying this as a male, of course, when it comes to estrangement. But I do think, though, that when this happens, it needs to be discussed. Sometimes, yes, as you said, with regards to maybe getting answers to your questions, but other times not so much. Other times it's okay to just delve and just be on the surface, like we said with the funnel metaphor in one of my videos in that way. And I think it's important to discuss maybe perhaps neutral subjects, as we said before. Perhaps you know, any type of interest the other person would have. That if you talk about their other interests, then yes, they'll be more inclined to open up and talk about that usually. I think anybody that piques people's interest will usually want to expand more on that. But I think this is a complex question, and it deserves its own exploration, perhaps in a future video.
I think the takeaway here, and I'll leave this video cast with this thought, is women in particular personalize a lot of this, and it's really important to think about our cultural parameters, how we're raised, because in some ways this may not be personal at all. This may be about the ways in which sons are raised versus daughters. So I look forward to more conversation about this. It is a very deep and complicated topic, and I think we've touched upon it here, and it'll be fun to hear more what you have to say next time.
Absolutely, and I always appreciate our talks together like this, Fern. This is great that we're able to come together like this and to be able to put words to these dynamics that occur within relationships, and what you've seen and what you've heard and what I've seen and what I've heard, and just bringing it together, because I don't think that sibling estrangement is nearly discussed enough as it should be, and I'm just glad that we're able to put the words to this together, you and I. So thanks again for being here. This is great to be able to do this again.
Thank you. It's always great to be here.
All right, Fern. So we'll talk again soon. You take care.